Hey everyone, how you doing? Welcome to the channel. It's time to wrap up my October reading. So when I did my TBR for October, I did say that it was probably going to be a bit of a difficult reading month for me. I had a few things going on, but to be honest with you, they didn't actually knock back my reading as much as I'd anticipated them doing. There were other things which did, however, make it a difficult month for me. So I had my daughter's birthday and the in-laws staying for a week. That didn't actually get in the way of my reading as much as I thought it might. The Kickstarter launch for the Advent of Winter, however, did, because I had to put a lot of work in the last few days before launching that. So that was one thing. But it was more the books themselves. I had a couple of physical books that I was reading, which for some reason just took me a long time to get through, so that really slowed me down, but I'll talk more about that when I go through the individual books. As usual before that though, I'll run through the stats and leave the timestamps below so you can skip this bit and move straight onto the books if you want to. So I read 7 books in total, but I only actually finished 4 of them. I had 3 DNFs, which is very unusual. It's rare. I think I've only once before DNF 2 in a month, and here I have 3. So for the 4 books that I actually finished, that gave me 1,833 pages, taking me to a total of 30,897 pages read in completed books for the year to date. The average page count of the 4 that I finished in October was 458, so the average for the year to date is now at 517, and it was a good month in terms of the quality of the books that I finished. I ended up with 4.38 as the average rating for the 4, taking my average for the year to date up ever so slightly to 4.07. For the series stats, I've now started 16 different series in 2023, finished 6, so that is an increase of 1 in both of those categories. I'm up to date with 20 different series. There are 9 that I've decided I'm not going to continue and read book 2 of, which means that my total number of ongoing series is at 37. And then the number of days since I last finished a book and scored it 5 stars is sitting at 13 days. Okay, so as I say, 3 DNFs, and as usual I'll cover those off first before getting into the books that I did finish. I do have physical copies of all of these, and one of them is the physical copy that I was taking a long time through. So I was reading Wolf of Withervale by Joaquin Baldwin, and this is a really odd one. It might be more a case of this was just not the right time for me to be reading it, because the writing style, this is going to sound odd, the writing style was pretty good. I was finding it easy to read. However, I DNF'd this at 164 pages, which is about 28% of the book. And at that point, I didn't really feel that I was getting anywhere kind of further forward with the story. There were quite short chapters in here, and I was finding that although they were easy reading, I was tending to read a chapter and then put the book down instead of reading 2 or 3 or 4 chapters in a go. So that's what really slowed me down with this one. I thought the story was okay, but as I say, I wanted it to move forward a bit. There were a couple of bits within those 160 odd pages that I read where I felt that we're going to turn the page now and we're going to have our real kind of start of the story, the start of the hero's journey in kind of a literal sense rather than just figuratively. That didn't really happen though, and that's one of the reasons that I decided to put this book down. The other reason is I did find it a little bit strange. There were some, I would say quite graphic, but only in a very small way, sex scenes in here. I say that, it's kind of difficult to word it, but I say it like that because it would be a little bit strange. You would have, in many stories, a sex scene would come along and you'd kind of fade to black and you wouldn't see the detail of it. This was almost like the exact opposite of that. We had very minimal detail. There were sort of a couple of lines talking about what was happening, but in no real detail at all. And then it would just finish with one quite graphic line at the end of it. And it was just very strange, and it felt kind of out of place with the rest of the book and with the rest of the sex scene that was before it as well. So that really threw me, and there were a couple of those that didn't really work for me just because of the way they were integrated into the story. So as I say, the writing style and the kind of the overall idea of the story in this very pretty book did really work for me, but maybe everything together didn't work for me, or maybe it wasn't the right time. So I might go back to this one at some point, but because I was coming up to the middle of the month, I'd been reading it for a little bit over 2 weeks, and I was only 160 pages in of 500, 600 or so pages total. I decided it was time to put this one down. Next up was one of my buddy reads with my friend Nina. We did 2 in October. This one though was For the Black Hawks by David Ragg. I listened to this one on audio, and the reason that I put this one down at, I wrote it down somewhere, 21%, so 90 odd pages equivalent in the book itself. I felt that I wasn't really taking anything in. Now, that's not to say that I was not really listening, I wasn't paying attention or anything along those lines, but rather that I was listening to it, I was paying attention, but I didn't feel like there was anything kind of worthy of taking in and really holding on to. There didn't really seem to be enough happening that was exciting me. And it's called The Black Hawks, and I think by the time I put it down at that 20 odd % through, we just started to meet the Black Hawks themselves, so that was maybe a little bit odd. But the main character that we did have, that we spent most of the book with, or perhaps all of the book with, I guess, up to that point, he just really didn't work for me. I get the idea that he's supposed to be kind of a really good warrior, someone who joins the Black Hawks maybe and becomes one of the heroes of the band. I don't know, because I didn't get that far. But he just didn't come across that way at all. He seemed almost a bit weedy. He was running away rather than standing to fight, although sometimes he didn't have a choice and he had to stand and fight. And it just didn't work for me. I didn't gel with him as a character, but also the rest of the book just wasn't working for me for a number of different reasons. I really did feel bored with this one, and I ummed and ahed for a little bit before deciding to put it down, but it didn't get any better, so I decided to move on and find something else. And then the third of the books that I DNF'd in October was Sewell From Gold to Iron and Rust, which I've said wrong 2 or 3 different times in different ways, and for which I apologise. This is by Jackie Davis and Katie Grierson, and it was a recent semi-finalist in SBFBO. This one came out of my TBR jar, and I nearly didn't get it into October, to the point where I actually put it on my list as a carryover basically for my November TBR, but I did have a couple of days left at the end of the month, so I thought I'd start on it early, and as it happens I ended up finishing with it as well because I wasn't enjoying it so much. This one I got up to 35%, about 150 pages through the book. And there were 2 kind of real things, I guess, that weren't working for me. One was the characters and the overall story just wasn't gripping me enough. But the main thing was the writing in it. I didn't get on with it at all. It was one of those things where something came up and I noticed it. And once I noticed it, I couldn't not notice it. And it started to really get on my nerves a little bit. That was the use of the word never instead of not. So characters would speak, but it was also in the narrative, it wasn't just the dialogue. They would use never where I would expect them to use not. So as an example that I'll paraphrase because I haven't written it down, it was a conversation between 2 characters, and it went something along the lines of, I hope you were never woken up, and the character would reply, I was never sleeping. And it just sounded really odd, but as I say, because it was so much, this is a 414 I think, 420 odd page paperback, and I did a search in the Kindle, so I had the ebook version as well, and the word never is literally used 500 times within this. Within certain chapters they do come up a lot more because it's certain people who use this more than others do, and it just made it really, really noticeable that it was coming up 4 or 5 times per page as I was reading. So with that one, the story itself wasn't really gripping me, but it was that writing style, which I can see why it was done and what the kind of intention was, but it just didn't work for me. It got to the point where it was kind of irritating me a little bit, so I had to put this one down. Okay, so then moving on to the books that I did finish then, and I said there were two buddy reads, so Nina and myself are doing a sci-fi kind of splurge this year, and continuing into next year as well. But for October we're starting a new series, which is The Way Stations by N.C. Scrimgeour, starting off with book one here, Those Left Behind. I had a good time with this one. Again, it was an audiobook read, and I think the audiobook was one that did work well for it. Just sidetracking first of all for a little bit to talk about the audio itself, I think it works better with sci-fi because you do have specific elements this can be used, but I like how they used a kind of sound effect at various points in the story. So when you've got people in ships or wherever they are and they're talking to each other over radio, you hear the character whose point of view you're listening from just talking as normal, but the response coming over the radio, you can hear it kind of distorted through the radio, and I think it's something that was done quite sparingly. It's obviously just when it was necessary in those particular circumstances, but it worked really well. It wasn't used for really anything else outside of that, which I think would have got a little bit too much unless you're listening to an actual kind of graphic audio, but in here I think it worked really well. I liked the story itself. We had several different characters who I felt really at home with, and I liked reading their individual chapters. I'm looking forward to seeing where some of those go in the future. There was a good level of intensity, there was a good overall story. You've got people who are leaving a planet behind basically to go and find somewhere new to settle down, or for their people to settle, because resources are dwindling. They're on a timetable basically, because they have to find a new home before it's too late, and they go through these kind of interplanetary or intergalactic gates that are guarded by these way stations, and then you've got people on the other side who are not welcoming them. Basically, they want them to stay on their side of the gate. They don't want this influx of new people coming along, potentially causing trouble, battling with them for their resources, etc. So there's a good level of political intrigue and also betrayal in here as well. And as I say, I'm really interested to see where the story goes because I had a good time with this one. I gave this one 4.5 stars because it was a really enjoyable story. It wasn't quite a 5-star read for me, but it wasn't too far off. Then I did another audiobook. This is the book that I finished in October, or the series rather that I finished. I read Until the Last by Mike Shackle, book 3 of The Last War. So with the first two books in this series, We Are the Dead and A Fool's Hope, I had a good time with them, although there were some elements in that second book that didn't necessarily work for me. I can see how, or why rather, they were done, and I quickly got over it, but I just didn't like the direction it took at the time. It made things a little bit too easy, if I'm being honest with you, and I didn't appreciate that so much. It kind of gave us almost a superhero character, like a Marvel type superhero, and I think it was just a little bit too much. It made them a bit too overpowered. In this third book in the series, I liked the way that was not necessarily toned down, but the book kind of focused more on the human element. There were things that were put into place to combat this kind of superheroine, but it was more to do with the other people as well, because you spent an equal amount of time with several different characters. And I like the way that was done. It didn't make it that this kind of superhero coming along basically saved the day or made it so that her side were unbeatable. So I definitely appreciated that. It was a good way of dealing with what I think could have been a problem, as I say, making it all a little bit too easy, kind of taking away the intensity of certain moments, taking away the fear for your characters and so forth. The writing I thought was really good. I liked the overall story. There was some nice betrayals, but not the kind of the usual type of betrayal, I would say. I really appreciated how that was done. I liked how it meant that you didn't have characters who are always going to be safe. Basically, you don't know for basically any of the characters for certain if they're going to make it out at the end of the book alive. So I definitely like that. I appreciated the way it was done. Overall, it's a really good series. It's probably going to be one of those that when I let it sink in for a bit, leave it a bit of time after finishing this final book, I'm still going to rate the series up there with some of my favourites. So this one was my 5-star read for October. Really highly recommend the series. I had a great time with all 3 books, and I think this one pulled the series together quite nicely into a good, satisfying finish. So then a review copy of a book that comes out on, I think it's the 6th of November, that I read was The Hunter's Lament by Steve Pannett. This one's really short, it's just under 300 pages, but within this quite small paperback, the font size is actually pretty small as well, and it took me a long time to read this as a result. I did have kind of the first half of the book taken over a week and a half, something like that. And then the second half of the book I finished in a day or so, because I sat myself down and not forced myself to read, but I gave myself the opportunity and forced myself to take the opportunity to read. And this definitely wasn't a chore. It was a really enjoyable story. So you've got kind of an aging bounty hunter, and he's got a group around him, and they're all different ages. They're all at different stages of their career, I suppose, in bounty hunting, and they go out on a job for a grand wizard, essentially, of a country who's just taken over one of their rivals, and they're looking for the crown prince who has managed to escape the siege of his capital city. So obviously the crown prince still being alive, it's that kind of thread of hope for the people that there might be rebellion, they can take their country back and so forth, and they don't want that. So Bittersweet, the bounty hunter, and his crew are sent out amongst a raft of other bounty hunters to track him down, basically. So that does give another element to it as well, rather than it just being a crew or a single bounty hunter going out, tracking down their mark, bringing them back. You do have the interaction with other people who are hunting down the same mark, some of whom they've had past experience with as well, so they kind of know how they work and what type of people they are. So you've got them trying to set false trails, you've got them trying to do what they can to stay one step ahead, and so forth. And I thought it was really interesting, bearing in mind, as I say, it's only about 300 pages or just less than. There's quite a lot that's packed into here. There's no real magic, so it's a real low fantasy world until you get to a point at the end where you do actually see some of the magic that you've had little inklings about. And I thought that was done really well. It didn't overpower the book or any of the characters or anything like that, so I thought that was really good. And again, this is one that was more about the individual characters as you're learning about Bittersweet and his crew of bounty hunters as they go along and try to find this prince and so forth. So it was a really good story, even though it took me quite a while to get through it because it was just a really small font in this paperback, and it took me a while to get a good run at reading it. But once I did, as I say, I flew through the last half of it in a day or so because I had a really good time with it. So rambling aside, this one comes out, as I say, I think it's the 6th of November. I definitely recommend picking it up because I had a really good time with it. I gave it 4.5 stars because it was that good for me. And then the last book I read comes out, I believe, the day after, The Hunter's Lament. This one's the 7th of November. Either that or I've got those two dates the wrong way around. But this is Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree, the kind of follow-up / prequel, however you want to look at it, to Legends and Lattes. So Legends and Lattes was a surprise for me when I read it last year, it must have been, because I really enjoyed it. It's not really my sort of thing, but it was just a nice, comfortable read. This one was very much the same, but it was also very different. I don't think it was as good a book as Legends and Lattes. Part of that might have been because the novelty for me kind of wore off. I knew more what I was expecting going into it, but also, as I say, it was a very different book. So you've got a different theme to it, and I did feel at some times that it was almost like it was trying too hard to recapture the magic of that first book or second book, however you want to look at it, the first book in publication order, I guess. But it just didn't quite reach those same heights for me because it almost seemed forced, I guess. It was a bit like the author was taking his experiences as a published author and writing about those, which is good because you've got that kind of write what you know mentality. But for me, it just didn't quite work. It did give kind of an element of the known for me because it's in my kind of my circle, not my area of expertise, but it's an area that I've got great interest in. But it wasn't something that just really worked for me in this particular book form. But as we're talking bookshops, I suppose, because the main character Viv does spend a lot of time in one and she's reading books, and we did get snippets of the books, whether it was just summarising what had happened or actual pages that were being read from the book essentially. And I did think that bit of it was quite interesting because some of those stories actually sounded like they could be really interesting books in their own right. So, there's an opportunity there, I guess. But that aside, I did feel this one was a bit strange because of its kind of overall cozy label. It was a bit different because there were also some big battles in here, or not big battles, but there were some battles in here. You've got, at the start of the book, very similar to the way that Legends and Lattes started out, you've got a little bit about a job that Viv is going on, and she's injured basically and has to take some time recuperating, and that's where the bookshop comes in. There is an element later on that kind of changes the scope of the book, and that's where I guess the bone dust comes in. But you do have these couple of battles at the end which just seemed a little bit too out of place when put alongside the rest of the book, basically. So with this one, there were a number of characters who I did like. It's, very likeable characters in the whole. That's one of the elements of charm that the book does have, definitely. But overall, it just wasn't quite as good as the first book for me. Definitely recommend picking it up though if you did enjoy that first book, or if you're just looking to find out a little bit more about it. I would say you don't have to read Legends and Lattes first. Obviously, this one chronologically does take place earlier on, but it does kind of come full circle, and there are bits, basically the epilogue of the book would be spoilerish for Legends and Lattes, so just bear that in mind if you are considering reading them in chronological rather than publication order. So this one, as I say, it wasn't as good as Legends and Lattes for me. I gave it 3.5 stars, which is still really good. I could have given it 4 stars on another day, but I just felt that it was missing a little bit too much, and it just felt a little bit, ever so slightly, disjointed with the kind of marrying up the nice cozy part of it against the really not cozy side of it that comes in as you get through the book. So there we go. Anyway, definitely a good read, a good month for me in terms of the overall books that I've finished, a bad month for me in terms of the overall books that I didn't finish, but that's the way it goes sometimes, and that's not a problem. Let me know in the comments down below what you read in October. What was your favourite book of the month? I'll hopefully see you in the next video sometime soon. Until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.